Hello, folks. How are things going? I had a little tech problems this afternoon. I planned on having this video cut earlier, but I ended up having to run to campus, get my webcam, run all the way back, hook everything up. It appears like everything's working properly. I don't anticipate having any other problems, and so hopefully, cross our fingers, I won't have any of these hurdles again anytime in the future, right? But anyways, the goal of this video is to talk through some of your reading response papers. I've got a chance to give you a little bit of feedback to everybody, so you should have at least a few words to sort of work with as you move forward with your paper, right? And basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some of your topics a little more carefully, right? And I chose a few that I think are going to be illustrative and useful for everybody, right? And the goal of this is kind of twofold, right? So one of the objectives is, of course, for you to figure out a little more what I'm expecting from this particular paper. You're kind of going blind. You don't really have any models to work with, and so that might be helpful for some of you, right? But the other goal is to give you some insight into the process of textual analysis and how it works, right? And so pay really close attention as I'm going through some of these things I'm looking out for and watching for. And then as you're looking through the body of text this weekend to work on your first drafts of your paper, be doing the same thing. Be thinking about the same kind of stuff, right? All right, anyway, let's go and get started. So the first project that I want to look at is from Raina, right? And she's looking at the debate about public and private school systems, right? Which I think is a pretty interesting topic. And I have some experience with both. I lived for a while in a private boarding school, which was very strange for a working class person. So that's one interesting experience I've had. I've also worked in a public school before, right? And so I have a little insight into both of them. And I can tell you right away that the arguments about which of these is more effective are not going to be simple in any way, right? And that even the researchers themselves are going to have a considerable amount of disagreement about, which model is superior, right? So if you work for a private school or you're invested in the public school system, right, and you want to convince people to utilize that particular service, you're not going to be able to fall back on the evidence, right? I mean, obviously you're going to have to use it, right? You want to be truthful and honest with the people that you're arguing with about the advantages of each approach, right? But what's going to be more important is you thinking through the frameworks they're bringing to the table and thinking through what arguments they're making and how to play into those, right? And so that's the thing I want to encourage Raina to do. Now, I didn't ask her to talk about what body of text that she's looking at. I don't think I requested that specifically in the assignment. But I want to make some suggestions here and then show you how I might go about thinking about them, right? So let me go ahead and pull this up. So this is a subreddit that might help out some of you guys that are working on this sort of public issues stuff, right? And this subreddit's called Change My View, right? It's really interesting subreddit. It basically, the way it works is somebody will post an argument about a position, right? And then they'll ask someone to change their mind on that particular subject, right? And if I remember correctly, if someone does change their mind, they can award them like a delta or something like that, right? And it's pretty interesting. There often is like some really good dialogue, back and forth on this particular subreddit, right? But I wanted to go ahead and highlight this particular post here. Sorry, I had to reread it. So I want to go ahead and highlight this particular post here. So it's changed my view. I am a school board member. My wife is a teacher, but it's better to send my children to a private school, right? I'm just going to read a little bit of it here, right? So so this person says, there's been a lot of public discourse about the standards in public education. They go on to say the entire discussion is flawed because, however, no one really states the reality of public education. It has become a nanny for parents who cannot or choose not to take care of their children, right? And then they go on to say they're not disparaging public education, even though they just did, but whatever, right? And then in the next paragraph, right, they say, to suggest our schools are failing is a lie. Perhaps they are failing because children come to school hungry and cannot learn, or cold and do not have coats, or come with the mental trauma or domestic abuse. Those are all real issues, but should not be taken into consideration when judging a school good or bad. The judgment should only come from students who meet a baseline where the actual academic curriculum can be absorbed, right? So let's think through this, right? So the first thing you're going to notice here, there's no evidence in this article at all, right? There's no research. The person isn't supporting their opinion with any kinds of data or numbers, right? Which is kind of fascinating because this is a kind of conversation where you think people would rely on that stuff, but of course they're not, right? And I think this is, if we have to be honest, this is common for a lot of the positions that we hold on a variety of issues, right? And then if you're looking through here, there's some interesting sort of metaphors the person is using to help you understand like what the person's thinking about education, right? So one of the things they mention is that they shouldn't be a nanny, right? There's this idea that schools shouldn't be the parents of their children. They shouldn't have to take over those responsibilities, right? So there's that metaphor going on in the background. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but we get some insight into it in the next paragraph, right? Where the person says, they're failing because they're hungry and cannot learn, or cold and do not have coats, or come with mental trauma or domestic abuse, right? And so there's all kinds of assumptions being packed in here, right? So one of the assumptions is that public school kids are the kids that are going to tend to have these kinds of problems, right? And so there's a class-based argument being made here. Hopefully is one of the things that you see, right? So the assumption here is that people from certain kinds of backgrounds are more likely to experience these kinds of trauma, this kind of trauma and that sort of stuff, right? But then you get the real, like, the real, like, thrust of the sort of nanny argument, right? Where they say, this judgment should only come from students who meet, how is it fair to judge a school as failing if a good portion of the children fail because of things outside of the school's control, right? And then they go on to say, because public schools have to cater to the broken and the hungry, it takes away resources and time that could be devoted to the academic curriculum, right? And so now you're seeing the thrust of this argument here, right? And the argument here is basically whatever we want to call the academic curriculum doesn't involve working with students in their mental traumas. It doesn't involve, making sure they're fed. It doesn't involve like working on any of the problems outside of like mathematics and writing and that sort of stuff, right? And this is an interesting position because, I've been teaching for a long time now, and I can tell you right now that being an empathetic, caring person and paying attention to people's backgrounds and where they're coming from and their traumas and that sort of stuff is really essential to being a good teacher, right? You can't divorce their academic progress from their personal progress, right? That's just my opinion, of course, but anyway, right? And so the point here, right, is that you can see here all these frames about education coming into play, and it's really strongly influencing how this person is perceiving the situation, right? Now, if you go through, this is just one post. The neat thing about Change My View is I could see Raina like potentially writing her entire paper on this one post, right? Because there's all these long sort of detailed arguments, and so she could go through here, pick some of the highlights that she finds particularly interesting, and look at the kinds of arguments they're making there, right? Okay. Anyway, you can go to Change My View yourself. It's the website is reddit.com/r/changemyview, right? And maybe for some of you, you'll find this useful. For those of you, there are quite a few people doing coronavirus projects, and I saw at least a couple that deal with China and things like that. And if you wanted to move in that direction, that could potentially be really interesting. But this is just a resource for you if you're struggling to find like what body of text that you want to work with, right? All right, now the next one I want to look at is with Jacob Basta, right? And he's got this project. He wants to work on marijuana use, right? And the direction he wants to go in is he wants to look at like R weed, R MMJ, R marijuana. And I certainly can see where he could do that. Sort of I look through those subreddits and I can see where there's a potential for him making some arguments there. But once again, I want to point, so one of the things that he looks at here, well, he's got some perception. But once again, like when you're dealing with a subject like this, when we're talking about like marijuana, legalization and medical marijuana, recreational marijuana, and all that stuff, right? People's views in that are only partially based on arguments, right? They're only partially based on the scientific evidence of marijuana's effects, right? If we look really carefully at it, yeah, there are potentially some negative effects to marijuana, but it's certainly not as bad as some of our other recreational drugs that are mostly legal throughout the United States, especially like nicotine, alcohol, so on and so forth, right? So a lot of people's negative views towards marijuana aren't based on that stuff, right? And to emphasize this point and to give Jacob some direction about where to go, right? I wanted to show you this commercial about Leffe, right, which is a beer, right, and I want to contrast that with the depiction of marijuana users in the media, right? And I want to insist, I want to make it clear that not every like depiction of alcohol use appears this way in the media, right? This is just like an example, right? So let me go ahead and play this. I'm hoping the audio might be kind of crappy because it's going to be coming through the speakers and into the microphone, but I'm hoping this works out.
Weet je, soms voelt het alsof er binnen in mij een strijd wordt uitgevochten. Een strijd tussen twee wolven. De ene wolf staat voor de vraag, snelheid, lust, vuur, ego. De andere wolf staat voor de antwoord, rust, liefde, water, samenhorigheid. Het is een harde en medogeloze strijd. En welke wolf wint? Dat zal de tijd uitwijzen.
Lessen, dat is proeven van het leven.
All right, now the point here, the one thing I want you to see in this video here that's really really interesting, right, is we got hold on a second, another ad coming up here. The thing I want to show you that's really interesting in this video, right, is you can see some of these tropes that we have associated with alcohol like appear here pretty readily, right? So there's a sophistication, right? We can tell these people are a little sophisticated in some ways, right? They're masculine, right? They're older guys, but they're masculine guys, right? They're talking about wolves and crap, right? They got their fancy little goblets and they're all dressed up really nice and that sort of thing, right? So there's this sort of gentleman intellectual masculinity that's sort of coming through in this video here, right? And there are other depictions of alcohol use, obviously, but there is definitely a strong current of this in our culture, right? There is ways to drink alcohol that are sophisticated, right? Like if you're, you like scotch or you drink bourbon or something like that, there's definitely ways you could be a wealthy, sophisticated person and still enjoy alcohol in a lot of ways, right? There's a identity that you can adopt there. Right? Now I want to contrast this with Pineapple Express, which I think is how most of us sort of understand the relationship between marijuana use and identity, right? And I'm just going to show you a couple of little parts. This is the most famous scene from the movie, right? This is the thug life scene, right? And so I'm just going to start this off. I just want to show you like the initial part and then just like kind of pause it so you can get a sense of what's going on here, right? Okay, so I'm going to pause this here. So, basically, I don't remember all the details about the movie. Sorry, Jacob. As much as I love this film, I wasn't going to watch it again. But I know that he got in a lot of trouble and he got shot and a bunch of things, right? And he's preparing to die, basically, right? And you can see, like, you know, what he's decided to do in his preparation for death, right? I think there's, like, some wine coolers, like, over here. And then I think this is a bowl of ramen noodles. I was having trouble figuring that out. And then he's got a cake and what looks like some wine over here, right? And so the interesting thing is this guy is totally emasculated, right? I mean, he's the furthest possible from being masculine at this point. And it's represented in a bunch of different ways. Even on his toilet, you can see like these little fishies sort of hanging out here, almost this sort of childlike thing, right? And that's part of what makes Pineapple Express so funny is these guys are doing what we associate these marijuana smoking losers are doing this thing that we associate with masculinity, right? And so if you kind of scroll back to the famous scene from the movie, I'm going to go ahead and show this to you. If you haven't seen it before, it's pretty damn funny, but let me go and play it.
Jones must be wrong melon farmers. Not lying. Just make sure you get those. I don't want to run them over in the back and shoot my face off, okay?
And anyway, you can kind of see, you know, the why we see them as ridiculous here, right? I mean, they're holding guns. They're obviously, like I said, they're losers, right? they're driving around to rap music, you know what I mean? It's trying to replicate those scenes that we've seen in so many of those movies. The claim that thug life statement is obviously the furthest possible from the truth in relation to these particular people, right? And so there's something going on here, right? When you're talking about like what space a marijuana user can inhabit, comparatively speaking, to an alcohol user, it's smaller, right? We don't really have, at least in my opinion, the same sort of model in our culture of the sophisticated marijuana user, right? The person who does it on the weekends and has refined tastes and only buys the best stuff, and you know, buys craft marijuana or whatever you want to call it, right? And that's, I think, if we're talking about like why is marijuana legalization often dismissed in our culture in various places, I mean, I think that probably has more to do with it than any of the rational arguments that we might make one way or the other, right? Does that make sense, right? So hopefully you're kind of getting the, but the important thing here, you'll see what I did here, is that I was looking at a contradiction, right? So we have one drug that we know is really dangerous, and then we have this other drug that we at least have some evidence to suggest is not quite as much, right? And there's a contradiction in how our culture deals with this, right? Where there's this sense of you can be an alcohol drinker and have this sense of refinement and taste, right? While with marijuana use, you're a loser, right? I think that's pretty much this sort of larger view of marijuana usage, right? So that's an interesting thing to look at. So if you were looking at frames about marijuana use, that would be a route to go, right? Now, this final part with the coronavirus, right? So I have a lot of people working on the coronavirus, and there are a lot of different directions you can go with this project, right? But I just want to show you one thing I've been thinking about a lot lately. So this is the Reopen California group. I don't know if you've noticed, but they've been protesting at like Huntington Beach and some other places, right? And I've just sort of been looking through their posts just to get kind of a basic idea of some of the arguments they're making, right? And there's a lot of discussion lately of freedom and what freedom means and how different groups of people interpret that, right? So you got Thomas Carver here. He says, I think we should recognize there's a difference between a private business demanding we wear a mask to shop there and government demanding we use one. Private businesses have the right and we should respect that. If we don't care to wear a mask, we can shop elsewhere. It would be the same as visiting, okay, but demanding we wear one in public is a violation of rights, right? And that's sort of an interesting view, right? I remember when I was growing up, when the seatbelt laws were starting to get enacted in North Dakota, my dad was like really resistant to wearing seatbelts. And I remember he used to say things very similar, like, you know, I don't like the government forcing me to wear seatbelts, right? But there's a point here, right? There is a sense that when the government asks you to do something like wear a mask, that isn't, or forces you to do something like wear a mask, that is infringing on a sense of freedom and how that operates and how that works, right? And there are all kinds of posts along those lines if you look through here, right? And so if you were doing a project on the coronavirus and you wanted to look at like what frames like conservative groups are using to argue for reopening the United States, this is something you could do. You could just take a look through the Reopen California site and just get a sense for the kinds of arguments they're making here, right? And the goal here, remember, it's, you know, I don't think us humanities folk are always as used to doing inductive stuff, right? Where you work with the body of evidence and then draw your conclusions from that, right? But that's part of what your goal should be. It should be to look at what you see and be honest with what you find, right? So whatever frames seem to emerge are all grist for the mill. They're all things that you could potentially talk about in an interesting paper, right? So hopefully this helps out, like give you a sense of what I'm looking for. I'm not going to have a reading quiz, you know, or a module quiz for this particular one. I feel like, you know, if you're struggling with your paper, you can watch the module. But I'm hoping that some of the things that we talked about here are going to help you think through your own work for your paper.